There is a good chance that right now, in this exact moment, you are lying in the dark and your mind will not stop. You have tried turning over. You have tried closing your eyes more firmly, as if that were a strategy. You have stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet, and the quiet has not helped at all. And here is the thing almost nobody tells you. The ancient Greeks had exactly this problem too. 2,500 years ago, in the greatest civilization the Western world had ever produced, in the city that gave us philosophy and democracy and theater and the Olympic Games, ordinary people lay awake in the dark and could not sleep. And what they did about it is one of the most quietly fascinating stories in all of human history. So here is what I am asking you to do. Just keep listening. Do not try to sleep yet. Just let these words come to you in the dark, because by the time this story is finished, by the time we have walked through every remedy and ritual and dream temple and herb garden and midnight conversation that the ancient Greeks had for the sleepless hours, you will not be trying to sleep at all. You will simply be there in ancient Greece, and sleep will find you on its own, so settle in. We are going a long way back tonight, and we are going to take the longest, slowest, most comfortable route possible. The ancient Greeks understood sleeplessness better than any other civilization of their age, and perhaps better than most civilizations of any age, because they had the unusual habit of thinking very carefully about everything, including the things that happened to them at night. They were, to an extraordinary degree, a culture that examined its own experience with a rigor and an openness that was rare in the ancient world. Other civilizations certainly had their wisdom traditions and their remedies for sleepless nights, but the Greeks wrote things down, debated them in public, challenged received wisdom, and produced a body of thought about sleep and its absence that is still being read and discussed by scholars and sleep researchers today. The physician Hippocrates, who practiced and taught on the island of Kos in the 5th century before the Common Era, devoted serious attention to sleep and its disruption. The philosopher Aristotle wrote an entire treatise on sleep and dreaming. The poet Homer, centuries before either of them, described sleep with a reverence that reveals how central it was to the Greek understanding of human life. To understand what the Greeks did when they could not sleep, you first have to understand what sleep meant to them, because it was not simply what it means to us. Sleep for the ancient Greeks occupied a complicated and somewhat sacred position in the cosmos. They personified it as a god, Hypnos, whose name has given us the modern word hypnosis and a whole family of related terms. Hypnos was a gentle deity, depicted typically as a young man with wings at his temples, often carrying a poppy or a horn from which he poured sleep-inducing liquid over mortals. He lived in the underworld, in a cave through which the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, flowed. He was the twin brother of Thanatos, which is death, and Homer in the Iliad refers to them together as twin brothers, comparing the god of sleep to the god of death with a directness that is initially startling, but makes a certain deep sense when you sit with it for a while. Sleep was not simply rest. It was a kind of small dying, a nightly release from the self, a dissolution of the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. This divine status of sleep meant that failing to sleep was not merely a physical problem for a Greek, it was potentially a spiritual one. If sleep was a gift from Hypnos, and Hypnos was a god with his own domain and his own reasons for giving or withholding his gift, then a sleepless night could mean many things. It could mean the god was busy. It could mean you were being kept awake by another divine force, perhaps the worries sent by Zeus, or the anxieties of conscience, or the dreams of warning that the gods sometimes sent precisely in the liminal hours between waking and sleep. The Greeks did not share our modern tendency to treat insomnia as purely a mechanical failure of the body that needs to be corrected with the right chemical. They saw it as something with meaning, something that was happening for a reason, even if the reason was not always clear. And yet they were also supremely practical people. And the practical question of what to do when you could not sleep occupied their considerable intelligence with the same thoroughness they brought to philosophy and mathematics. The remedies, rituals, and approaches they developed span an extraordinary range. From the sophisticated medical advice of Hippocratic physicians to the folk remedies passed down in households for generations. From the elaborate incubation rituals of the healing sanctuaries to the simple wisdom of old women who knew which herbs to pick and when. We are going to explore all of it slowly and in detail, because the story of how the ancient Greeks dealt with sleepless nights is, in many ways, a complete portrait of how they lived and what they believed and what they valued when the day's demands fell away and they were left alone with the dark. Let us begin with the Greek night itself, because the experience of darkness in the ancient world was so different from our own that it requires some careful reconstruction. There was no artificial light beyond fire. The streets of Athens at night were dark in a way that is genuinely difficult to imagine from within our modern world of constant illumination. The wealthier households might have oil lamps burning in a room or two, small clay or bronze lamps with a wick floating in olive oil, producing a flame the equivalent of perhaps a single modern candle. The streets outside were substantially darker. The moon, when it was full, was the primary source of outdoor light, and the Athenians actually organized some of their social activities around the lunar calendar, in part because a full moon meant you could actually see where you were going in the street. The darkness was not just the absence of light. It had a texture and a presence that people in ancient times described with a specificity that suggests genuine familiarity with its qualities. The Greek word for darkness was skotos, and there were several related words distinguishing different qualities of dark: the darkness of night, the darkness of a closed room, the darkness of the underworld, the darkness that comes before vision returns. This was a culture that knew its darkness well, and in that darkness, the sounds of the night took on a prominence and a significance that our own noisy, light-filled nights have mostly obscured. The calls of night birds, the wind in the olive trees that surrounded most Greek settlements, the occasional sound of water from a fountain or a stream, the distant bark of dogs, which the Greeks kept abundantly and which served as the primary nighttime security system for most households. The Greek house, the oikos, was typically built around a central courtyard, the all, which was open to the sky. This meant that the sounds of the outdoors were always somewhat present even inside the house, and the sky was always visible from within the domestic space. The sleeping arrangements in a Greek household were organized around social hierarchy and practicality rather than the Western modern ideal of individual private bedrooms. The master and mistress of the household slept in an andren or in the women's quarters depending on the household's arrangement. Slaves slept wherever was appropriate to their role, sometimes near the door for security purposes, sometimes in rooms adjacent to the areas they served. Children slept together or near their mothers. The beds themselves were constructed of wood frames strung with leather or rope and covered with wool or linen stuffed mattresses. The wealthy might have beds of carved and decorated wood, perhaps inlaid with ivory or silver, and might use fine woolen blankets dyed in expensive colors. The less wealthy slept on simpler versions of the same basic design, with wool blankets dyed in the natural colors of undyed wool, which is a soft off-white or brown or gray. The night garment was typically a lighter version of the daytime chiton, the basic Greek tunic. Since the Greeks did not generally sleep in a specifically designated sleeping outfit as modern people do, but simply in a lighter, looser garment that would not have been worn outdoors. So picture this room. It is somewhere in Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era at the height of the city's glory. The house is well built but not grand, belonging to a craftsman or a merchant of middling means, a man we will call Nicias, which was an extremely common Athenian name, and his wife, whom we will call Myrrhine, equally common. They have been asleep since not long after dark, because in a world where night means genuine darkness and morning means genuine light, the body's rhythms tend to align themselves with those of the sun, with a directness that electric light has largely destroyed in the modern world. But now Nicias is awake. It is somewhere in the middle hours of the night, the hours the Greeks called the mesonicton, the middle of the night, and he cannot get back to sleep. What woke him is not entirely clear even to him. He has the sense of a dream that was not quite pleasant, not quite a nightmare, but not restful either. One of those dreams that leaves a residue of unease without any specific content to point to. He lies in the dark and listens to the sounds of the house. He can hear his wife breathing beside him with the easy rhythm of uninterrupted sleep, which he finds both comforting and faintly irritating in the way that sleepers often find the sleep of others irritating when they cannot share it. He can hear from somewhere in the house the sound of one of their slaves, old Thratter, who has been with the household for 30 years, moving about in the kitchen area with the small purposeful sounds of someone who is always up before dawn anyway. Nicias lies still for a while, which is the first thing he does. Because the Greeks had a general philosophical disposition toward patience and toward not immediately leaping to action as a response to every discomfort. The Stoics, who were slightly later than our period, but developed from ideas that were already circulating in 5th century Athens, had a specific practice of lying with discomfort rather than fighting it, of observing it from a slight distance and seeing whether it resolved on its own. Nicias is not a philosopher in any formal sense. He is a man who makes and sells ceramic amphorae, the beautiful painted storage vessels for oil and wine that are now in museums around the world. But he has absorbed something of the Athenian intellectual atmosphere, the way all Athenians did who lived in a city that was essentially one large ongoing conversation about how to live. And his first response to his wakefulness is to simply be with it for a while, to lie there in the dark and not fight it. But as the minutes pass and sleep does not return and the thoughts begin to multiply, as thoughts always do in the sleepless hours, Nicias begins to consider his options. And here is where the Greek approach to sleeplessness becomes genuinely interesting, because the options available to him are numerous, well considered, and deeply embedded in a whole cosmological framework that transformed the simple act of being awake at night into something much richer than mere inconvenience. The first thing he thinks of, and the most immediate thing, is breathing. The Hippocratic medical tradition, which Nicias knows about in the general way that educated Athenians knew about things, from conversations at the agora, from listening to physicians at symposia, from the general diffusion of ideas in a city where ideas were the primary product, emphasized breathing as a fundamental indicator and regulator of health. The Hippocratics observed that the breath during sleep was slower and deeper than during waking, and that restoring that deeper, slower breathing pattern was the most direct route back to sleep. This was not phrased in the technical language of modern sleep research, but the observation is correct. As we now know from the extensive work on the parasympathetic nervous system and its relationship to slow breathing. Nicias breathes slowly. He breathes out longer than he breathes in. He does this with a deliberate patience, and in the dark room with his wife's regular breathing beside him and the distant sounds of the Athenian night filtering through the courtyard, the exercise begins to work its gentle alchemy on his nervous system. Let us stay with the Hippocratic medical tradition for a while, because it is one of the most important and most fascinating threads in the Greek approach to sleeplessness, and it deserves to be explored in some detail. Hippocrates of Kos, who is called the father of medicine and who genuinely deserves the title for the revolutionary step he took of insisting that illness had natural rather than supernatural causes and should be treated by natural rather than supernatural means, wrote about sleep extensively in his medical texts. The Hippocratic corpus, the large body of texts attributed to Hippocrates and his school, though probably written by multiple authors over several generations, contains repeated references to sleep as a critical indicator of health and to sleeplessness as a symptom requiring diagnosis and treatment. The Hippocratics understood sleep through the lens of their theory of humours, the four bodily fluids, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, whose balance or imbalance determined health and disease. Sleep was believed to occur when the warmth of the body, carried by the blood and its associated humour, moved inward from the limbs and surface of the body toward the interior organs, particularly the stomach and liver. This inward movement of warmth produced the sensation of heaviness and drowsiness that preceded sleep. Sleeplessness, conversely, was believed to result from conditions that prevented this inward movement, too much heat in the head, an excess of the lighter humours like yellow bile that kept the spirits active and the mind agitated, or disturbances of digestion that kept the body's energies focused on the stomach rather than allowing them to settle into the deeper rhythm of rest. The treatments that followed from this understanding were elegant in their internal logic. If sleeplessness resulted from excess heat in the head, then cooling the head was indicated. The Hippocratic texts recommend washing the head and feet in cool water before sleep, a practice that was so widely adopted that it became a kind of standard pre-sleep ritual for Greeks who were having trouble sleeping. The cool water would draw the blood and warmth away from the head toward the extremities, allowing the internal warmth to settle and the drowsiness to follow. This is actually physiologically reasonable. Cooling the extremities does help regulate body temperature in a way that promotes sleep onset, as modern sleep researchers have confirmed through studies on thermoregulation and sleep. The Greeks arrived at this through a completely different theoretical framework, but they arrived at something real. If sleeplessness resulted from excess bile, from the hot, dry humor that produced agitation and wakefulness, then the treatment was to calm and moisten. The Hippocratic physicians recommended cooling foods and drinks in the evening before sleep, diluted wine rather than strong wine, which was believed to be too heating. Vegetables and foods that were considered cooling in their nature, including cucumbers, lettuce, and various herbs. The lettuce recommendation is particularly interesting because we know now that lettuce does contain small amounts of lactucarium, a mild sedative compound that is present most strongly in wild lettuce but exists in cultivated varieties too. And the Greeks appear to have used it specifically for its sleep-inducing properties long before any modern chemical analysis could confirm what they had observed empirically. The evening meal itself, the deipnon, was subject to careful consideration in the Hippocratic texts when it came to sleep quality. The physicians were emphatic that heavy eating late in the evening was a major cause of troubled sleep, a conclusion so obvious from ordinary experience that it is sometimes easy to forget it took careful systematic observation to formalize it into medical advice. The recommendation was to eat the main meal in the early to mid-afternoon and to eat only lightly in the evening, which was the standard practice in the Greek world and reflected both the agricultural rhythms of Mediterranean life and the medical wisdom of the Hippocratic school. The heavy midday meal allowed digestion to proceed during the afternoon waking hours, so that by the time evening came and sleep was sought, the body's digestive work was largely finished, and the internal warmth could migrate appropriately toward rest. Wine occupied a fascinating and complicated position in the Greek understanding of sleep. The Greeks drank wine at almost every social occasion, but they almost never drank it undiluted, which they considered barbaric and potentially dangerous. Wine was diluted with water in ratios that varied by occasion and by the degree of formality of the event. But a common ratio at a moderate symposium might be 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. This diluted wine, called kekramnon, was a very different drink from straight wine, lower in alcohol, serving partly as a flavoring for water that might otherwise taste mineral or flat, and creating a mild social lubricant rather than a serious intoxicant. For sleep purposes, the Greeks made a distinction that was medically subtle and practically important. Small amounts of diluted wine in the evening were believed to aid sleep by warming the stomach moderately and calming the nervous system, in the way that a mild sedative might. This was supported by observation and was, within certain limits, reasonable advice. But excess wine was believed to disturb sleep in the second half of the night, producing vivid and unpleasant dreams and causing the sleeper to wake feeling worse than if they had not slept at all. The Hippocratic tradition was therefore not a temperance tradition, but it was a moderation tradition, and the specific recommendation around wine and sleep was a little diluted with dinner. Not after dinner and not too close to sleep. The herbs and preparations used for sleep in ancient Greece form one of the most detailed and interesting chapters of the story, and they deserve considerable attention. The Greeks were sophisticated botanists, not in the modern scientific sense, but in the empirical sense of people who had spent many generations paying very careful attention to what plants did and what happened when you consumed them in what quantities. The herb we have already mentioned, lettuce, was one of the most important. Wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, was used in preparations that were genuinely sedative. The milky sap of the wild lettuce plant was collected, dried, and used in small doses as a sleep aid, and Dioscorides, the first-century pharmacologist who compiled the definitive ancient work on medicinal plants, described lettuce preparations in terms that make clear they were standard medical tools for sleeplessness. Poppy was the most powerful of the Greek sleep remedies and also the most carefully regulated. The poppy flower in its various species produced compounds that we recognize as the basis of opium. And the Greeks were aware that poppy preparations in small doses produced sleep, and in large doses produced something much more dangerous. The connection between Hypnos, the god of sleep, and the poppy was not coincidental. Depictions of the sleep god often showed him holding a poppy, and the association was understood as more than decorative. The poppy actually induced sleep, actually brought you closer to the realm of Hypnos, and this made it a plant with a sacred dimension as well as a practical one. Poppy preparations were used medicinally for sleep, for pain, and for anxiety, and the Greek medical tradition seems to have understood reasonably well the risks of excessive use, recommending small doses and cautioning against dependency. Again, without the chemical vocabulary we would use today, but with the empirical observation of people who had watched what happened when the cautions were ignored. Valerian was another herb in the Greek sleep arsenal, though it was known by Greek names including foo and nardos in some traditions. Valerian root has genuine sedative properties that modern research has confirmed, acting on the same GABA receptors in the brain that many modern sleep and anxiety medications target. The Greeks dried the roots and used them in preparations, sometimes combined with wine, sometimes steeped in water, and described their effect in terms of calming and warming that settled the nervous energy and allowed the body to find its rest. There is something both humbling and reassuring about this continuity, that the plant in a bottle of valerian supplements on a modern drugstore shelf is essentially the same plant that a Greek physician recommended 2,500 years ago for the same problem. The chemistry was not understood then, but the effect was observed, recorded, and passed along. Hyssop, chamomile, lavender in its Mediterranean wild form, marjoram, and thyme were all part of the Greek botanical tradition around sleep, used variously as teas, as aromatic preparations to breathe before sleep, and as additions to the bath water. The bath itself was an important part of the Greek pre-sleep ritual for those who could access one, and the public bathhouse, the balneaeon, which existed in many Greek cities, was sometimes used in the evening as a preparation for sleep. The warm water would relax the muscles, the steam would calm the airways, and the social function of the bathhouse meant that you left it with the gentle, pleasant tiredness of a body that has been both physically relaxed and socially satisfied. Now let us follow Nicias through the rest of his sleepless night, because the medical tradition is only one thread in this story. He has been lying quietly, breathing slowly for some time, and sleep has not returned. He makes a decision that any Athenian would understand. He gets up. There is a philosophy embedded in this decision that is worth noting. The Greeks did not believe that lying still in bed fighting wakefulness was the correct response to an extended period of sleeplessness. The Hippocratic tradition actually counseled mild activity as a response to the kind of wakefulness that resulted from excess of active humor, because the activity would use up the agitating energy and allow the body to settle afterward. And there was a more general Greek conviction that the fight against a condition often made the condition worse, while acceptance of it and movement through it allowed it to resolve. This is not far from what modern cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is the most evidence-based current treatment for chronic sleeplessness, recommends. CBT for insomnia specifically advises against lying awake in bed for long periods, recommending instead that if you have been awake for 20 minutes without sleep approaching, you should get up. Do something calm in low light and return to bed when you feel genuinely sleepy. The Greeks arrived at this same advice through a combination of medical observation and philosophical temperament. Nicias goes to the courtyard of his house. The courtyard, the hall, is the heart of the Greek house, and at night in summer it is the coolest part of the house, open to the sky, with whatever breeze the Attic night is offering. He can see the stars. In ancient Athens, on a clear night away from the sea mist, the stars were extraordinary. There was no light pollution in any modern sense. The Milky Way would have been a genuine river of light across the sky, not the faint smear that most modern urban and suburban dwellers know. The individual stars were brilliant and stable. The Greek astronomer and mathematician Hipparchus had, a few centuries after Nicias's time, catalogued over 800 stars with an accuracy that was not surpassed until the Renaissance. But long before formal astronomy, ordinary Greeks looked at the night sky with an intimacy and a familiarity that came from living under it every clear night without competition from artificial light. Nicias knows the stars the way he knows the streets of his neighborhood. He knows the Pleiades, the seven sisters, whose rising and setting mark the planting and harvest seasons, and whose position now tells him it is deep in the night but not yet approaching dawn. He knows Orion, which the Greeks called Orion the Hunter, and whose position tells him the season. He knows the Great Bear, which the Greeks called Hellas, and which serves as his compass because it circles Polaris in the north. Watching the stars on a sleepless night was not, for a Greek, a matter of distraction or admiration only. It was a kind of reading, a consultation with a text that was permanently overhead and that contained, encoded in its patterns and movements, the time and the season, and something of the order of the cosmos. The Greeks believed, with varying degrees of literalness, that the stars were connected to human fate, that the cosmos, the ordered universe, was not separate from human affairs but continuously, intricately related to them. Standing in the courtyard, watching the stars was therefore a kind of communion with the larger order, and for Nicias, standing there in his light tunic in the warm Attic night, something in that communion is genuinely calming. He thinks about what Pythagoras said about the music of the spheres. He has heard this idea discussed at a symposium he attended some months ago, the idea that the planets and stars in their movements produce a kind of celestial music, a harmony that human ears cannot hear, but that the cosmos is continuously performing. He does not know whether this is literally true. He is not sure the person who told him about it knows either. But the idea that the universe is, at its deepest structure, a kind of music, a pattern of harmonious relationships expressing themselves in movement and number, is an idea that does something to the feeling of being awake and small and alone in the dark. It makes it feel less like isolation and more like presence. He is awake in a universe that is singing. He is not asleep, but he is not lost. The Greek relationship with music as a remedy for sleeplessness deserves its own considerable attention, because it was extensive, theorized, and deeply embedded in the culture. The Greeks believed that music had direct effects on the soul, not as a metaphor, but as a literal physical and metaphysical reality. The Pythagoreans, the philosophical and mathematical brotherhood founded by Pythagoras of Samos in the 6th century, had developed an elaborate theory of how the different musical modes, the various scales and tunings used in Greek music, produced different effects on the human psyche. Some modes were considered stimulating and martial, some were considered sorrowful, some were believed to have therapeutic and calming effects appropriate for healing and for sleep. The mode called Lydian was considered particularly soft and relaxing, associated with private life and domestic emotion. Plato, in the Republic, actually argued against teaching the Lydian mode to young men training to be soldiers, on the grounds that it made them too comfortable and too peaceful, which tells you something about what it was believed to do. This same quality of peaceful comfort that made it unsuitable for warriors made it excellent for people trying to sleep. The orlos, the double-pipe flute, was considered to have particularly powerful mood-altering properties, partly because of its breathy, reedy tone and partly because of an ancient Greek belief that the orlos had been invented by Athene, who then threw it away because playing it distorted her face. And it was associated with ecstatic and transformative states. For someone who could not sleep, Greek practice included listening to lyre music played softly, or the humming of a simple melody that aligned with the Lydian mode, or the sound of the orlos at a distance carried through the night air. The therapeutic use of music for healing, including for sleep disorders, was formalized at the healing sanctuaries of Asclepius, the divine physician, where music was apparently a regular part of the healing environment. Patients at these sanctuaries, who were specifically seeking healing through divinely sent dreams, were prepared for their dream experience partly through music, which was used to calm the nervous system, quiet the waking mind, and open the deep self to whatever the god wished to send. These healing sanctuaries, the Asclepia, bring us to one of the most extraordinary and unique aspects of the Greek approach to sleeplessness, and one that deserves extended attention because it is so different from anything in modern medical practice, and yet was so central to the Greek experience of healing and dream. The cult of Asclepius, the divine son of Apollo who became the god of medicine, maintained healing sanctuaries called Asclepia in various locations throughout the Greek world. The most famous was at Epidaurus in the northeastern Peloponnese, a sanctuary complex of extraordinary beauty set in a wooded valley, with a theatre, a stadium, a great temple, baths, and the central healing structure, the abaton or encoimatorion, which was a long colonnaded hall in which suppliants came to sleep and receive healing dreams. The ritual of incubation, from the Latin incubare to lie on, was the central practice of the Asclepian sanctuaries, and it was specifically designed for people who were suffering from illness, including the kind of exhausted, chronic sleeplessness that often accompanied serious illness, and who sought healing through the medium of a divinely sent dream. A person seeking healing at Epidaurus would arrive at the sanctuary and undergo a period of preparation that might last days. They would bathe in the sanctuary spring, whose waters were considered sacred. They would fast for a prescribed period, varying by tradition from 1 day to 3 or more. They would make offerings at the temple of Asclepius, sacrificing an animal appropriate to their means, a cock being the traditional and minimum offering. A reference that becomes clearer when you recall that the dying Socrates, as recorded by Plato, famously said as his last words that Crito should sacrifice a cock to Asclepius. The cock was the appropriate offering because it announced the dawn, and dawn was the moment of return from the sleep of incubation, the moment when the dream carried the healer's message back into the waking world. After the preparatory period, the suppliant would be admitted to the abaton in the evening, carrying with them their sleeping mat and their blanket and the expectation of a divine encounter. The abaton was a long hall, partly open to the air, with a series of low platforms or couches along its length on which suppliants lay down in the semidarkness. Votive tablets found at Epidaurus and other Asclepia record hundreds of individual healing testimonials, cures attributed to the dreams sent by Asclepius during incubation. and they are astonishingly specific and diverse. People came with blindness and lameness and infertility and tumors and chronic pain and diseases of every kind, and the testimonials record cures of sometimes miraculous specificity. A man who had been blind for many years dreamed that Asclepius applied an ointment to his eyes and woke with restored sight. A woman who could not conceive dreamed of the god and became pregnant within the month. A man with a paralyzed hand dreamed of playing dice and woke to find his hand restored. These testimonials were set up as stone inscriptions at the sanctuary so that future suppliants could read them and have their faith strengthened, which is itself interesting as a use of written language in religious practice. They were also presumably carefully curated, recording the successes and not the failures, but there were failures. People who came to the sanctuaries and did not receive a helpful dream, or who received a dream they could not interpret, or who were not healed by whatever the experience brought. The healing sanctuaries were not infallible and did not claim to be. They were places where the divine might intervene, where the conditions for divine intervention were carefully cultivated, and where many people found that the combination of ritual preparation, fasting, sacred environment, and the expectation of meaningful dream experience produced something real. The modern understanding of what was actually happening at these sanctuaries is interesting. The fasting and purification rituals would have altered the biochemistry of the sleeping brain in ways that genuinely produce more vivid and memorable dreams. The sacred, expectant atmosphere would have activated the placebo response, which is not merely subjective, but produces real measurable physiological changes. The power of expectation, faith, and intention in healing is now the subject of serious medical research, and the results are not trivial. And for people suffering from chronic anxiety, exhaustion, and the kind of functional illness that has no obvious physical cause, what the Asclepia offered was a profound, sanctioned permission to stop, to lie down in a sacred place and rest, to be attended to, cared for, held within a ritual framework that said, "Your suffering is real, it is known to the God, and you are allowed to let go of it here." For someone who has not been sleeping, this permission to be held and to let go is not a small thing. It is possibly the most important thing. And the Greeks knew this, which is why the Asclepia were among the most visited and most beloved of all Greek sanctuaries, drawing suppliants from across the Greek world for centuries. Epidaurus particularly was famous not only for its healing sanctuary, but for its extraordinary theatre, which still stands and is still used for performances, and which was designed with acoustics so perfect that a sound made at the center of the orchestra can be heard clearly in the highest row of seats. The combination of the healing sanctuary and the theatre was not accidental. The Greeks understood theatre as a form of healing too, catharsis, the emotional purging through dramatic performance that Aristotle described as one of the primary purposes of tragedy, was understood as having real therapeutic effect on the soul. On the nights when incubation was not possible, when a Greek lay awake in their own house rather than in the sacred precinct of a healing god, there were other approaches rooted in a similar understanding of the dream world. Dream interpretation was an extremely serious art in ancient Greece, practiced professionally by specialists called wonarokratai, dream interpreters, who could be consulted when a dream seemed important or puzzling. But even before interpretation, the Greeks had elaborate beliefs about how dreams arrived and what kinds of dreams were trustworthy. Homer in the Odyssey gave us one of the most famous images in the ancient literature of sleep and dreams, the two gates of sleep. One made of ivory through which false and misleading dreams come to mortals, and one made of polished horn through which true and prophetic dreams pass. This image was so vivid and so apt that it was quoted, discussed, and elaborated by writers for centuries after Homer. It encoded a Greek understanding that not all dreams were equal, that some were random products of the day's activities and anxious thoughts, while others were genuine communications from the divine or from the deep self, carrying real information about the future or about the dreamer's situation. Learning to distinguish between the two was a skill, and it was a skill that the Greeks cultivated. Certain types of dreams were considered more likely to be true. Dreams that came in the second half of the night, when the stomach was empty and the body's digestion was complete, were considered truer than those of the earlier hours. Dreams that came just before dawn were especially trustworthy. Dreams in which a god or divine figure appeared and spoke clearly were to be taken very seriously. Dreams of obvious and literal content were generally less interesting than dreams rich in symbol and image that required interpretation. The whole taxonomy of dreams in ancient Greek culture is a detailed and fascinating system, and the person who lay awake in the middle of the night waiting for sleep to return might find genuine purpose in that waiting. The purpose of being present and alert for whatever the deeper layers of the night might send. Nicias, still in his courtyard, sits now on the low bench that runs along one side and looks at the stars, and thinks about a dream he had last week, one that he has not yet understood. He was in his workshop, but the workshop was arranged differently. The kiln was in the wrong place, and there was a stranger at the door who wanted to buy a particular amphora. But when Nicias showed him the amphora, the stranger pointed out that it had a crack he had not noticed before. He has been carrying this dream with him since, turning it over in his mind the way you turn a stone in your hand to feel its shape. He has not consulted a dream interpreter, partly from the natural male reluctance to admit to feeling uncertain and partly because the dream interpreters of Athens, while respected, also had a reputation for telling you things that cost a great deal to hear and that you then had to spend a long time worrying about. But he thinks about the crack in the amphora. He thinks about whether his business has a crack he has not noticed. He thinks about his relationship with his main supplier of clay, which has been slightly strained lately over pricing disagreement that he has not fully resolved. The dream turns in his mind in the dark, not with anxiety exactly, more with the slow, patient attention that problems deserve at 3 in the morning, when there is nothing else to demand your attention. The practice of using sleepless nighttime hours for reflection was not accidental in Greek culture. The night was understood as the time of the soul's more truthful activity, freed from the noise and social performance of the day. Philosophers, and the Pythagoreans particularly, kept specific practices for the end of the day and the beginning of the night that were designed to cultivate this reflective quality. The Pythagorean evening examination of conscience, in which one reviewed the day's events 3 times over in sequence, asking first what you had done, then how you had done it, then what you should have done differently, was a formal spiritual practice. It was also, incidentally, an extremely good way to process the emotional residue of the day, so that it did not show up as anxious rumination in the small hours of the night. The modern cognitive behavioral research on sleep is very clear that one of the major causes of nighttime wakefulness is unprocessed emotional material from the day. And the Pythagorean evening review was a direct and systematic way of processing that material before sleep rather than during it. Seneca the Younger, who was Roman rather than Greek, but who worked extensively in the Stoic tradition that grew directly from Greek philosophy, described his own version of this practice in language that resonates with anyone who has ever lain awake reviewing their day with less charity than they would wish. What illness have you cured today? He asked himself, what fault have you resisted? In what respect are you better today than you were yesterday? The practice was not self-flagellation, it was inventory. The point was not to condemn yourself for your failures, but to know clearly what they were, so that they could be addressed, and then to set them aside for the night. Having given them proper attention, Myrrhine, Nicias's wife, wakes when she hears him come back into the house. She has a cup of something prepared for these occasions. Because she is a practical woman who has been managing a household for 15 years, and who knows that her husband occasionally has these restless nights, and that a cup of warm honeyed wine with Chamomile steeped in, it is more effective than any conversation at getting him back to sleep. The chamomile, anthemis in Greek, was one of the most widely used sleep herbs in the ancient Greek world. Its flowers, dried and steeped in warm liquid, produced a mild sedative effect and, more importantly, a flavor and smell that was associated in the mind with warmth and calm and the ending of the day. The smell of chamomile was the smell of sleep preparations, the way that the smell of lavender is for many modern people, the smell of something that has been given to you to help you rest. The smell itself carries part of the message. Mirhain hands him the cup without much ceremony, because in a long and functional marriage ceremony often gives way to ease, and she sits with him for a little while he drinks it. This is perhaps the simplest and most universal of all the Greek remedies for sleeplessness, the presence of another human being. Not necessarily to talk, though they do talk a little, in the low voices of people talking in the dark, about nothing in particular. About whether the new neighbor's rooster is crowing earlier than it used to. About whether their daughter's teacher is actually as knowledgeable as he presents himself. About whether to buy a better clay stamp for the amphora workshop, which Nicias has been considering for several months. The conversation is not important. The importance is the voice, warm and familiar in the dark, and the body nearby, and the sense of the domestic world continuing around you in its ordinary rhythms, safe and known. Let us move now to the wider world of Greek sleeplessness, because Athens and its urban middle-class experience is only one part of the story. The Greek world in the classical period was not just Athens. It was an archipelago of city-states spread across mainland Greece, the islands of the Aegean, the coasts of Asia Minor, Sicily, and southern Italy. Each with its own traditions and practices, and its own local versions of the remedies for the sleepless night. And in the countryside, in the villages and farmsteads that surrounded the cities and that produced the food on which the cities depended, the approach to sleeplessness was different again. More tied to the land, to the seasons, to the old practices that had been passed down in households for generations before any philosopher or physician had written anything down. The farmer who could not sleep had a different set of concerns than the urban craftsman. His sleeplessness was more likely to be connected to the anxieties of the agricultural cycle, the weather, which was unpredictable and could ruin a harvest, the health of the animals, the progress of the growing season against the demands of the market and the tax collector. And his remedies were correspondingly more embedded in the natural world, more connected to the specific plants of the countryside, more reliant on the accumulated practical wisdom of people who spent their lives close to the land. One of the most interesting practices in Greek rural culture around sleep was the use of the sleeping spot. The idea that certain places in the natural landscape had the quality of inducing good sleep. Sacred springs were particularly associated with this quality. The water of certain springs was believed to carry the particular virtue of the deity of that place. And sleeping near a sacred spring after drinking its water was a way of placing yourself under divine protection for the night. The springs associated with the nymphs, those local nature deities who inhabited springs and groves and rocky places throughout the Greek countryside, were particularly associated with dreams and with sleep of a particularly deep and restorative kind. Someone who slept at a nymph spring and dreamed there was considered to have received something special, something beyond ordinary sleep, a nyctomania. A nocturnal madness or inspiration that left them, upon waking, with clarity or creativity or prophetic knowledge they had not had before. The nymphs themselves were associated with a particular kind of divine possession called nympholepsy, literally being seized by the nymphs, which was used to describe states of unusual inspiration or altered consciousness that were understood as the mark of divine favor. A person who was nympholeptos was someone who had been claimed by the nymphs, who lived with one foot in the ordinary world and one in the world of divine presence. Sleep at nymph-haunted spots was understood as the least dangerous form of contact with this realm. the form that gave you access to the nymph's transformative quality without necessarily overturning your entire ordinary life. You went there when you needed something from the deeper world, when the ordinary world was not providing what you needed, when your nights were troubled and your sleep would not come. And you placed yourself gently at the boundary and waited. The physician Galen, who practiced in the 2nd century of the Common Era and was the greatest systematic physician of the ancient world after Hippocrates, continued and expanded the Hippocratic tradition on sleep and wrote about it with a specificity and detail that allows us to reconstruct the full medical approach to sleeplessness in the later Greek and Roman world. Galen's approach to insomnia was multi-layered and sophisticated even by modern standards. He identified what we would recognize as different types of sleeplessness: the kind caused by pain, the kind caused by anxiety and agitated thoughts, the kind caused by fever, the kind caused by digestive problems, the kind caused by excess stimulation. Each type had its own approach. For the anxious, thought-tracing sleeplessness that is perhaps the most universally recognized kind, Galen recommended a specific combination of approaches. First, moderate exercise during the day, not vigorous exercise close to sleep, but movement earlier in the day that would use up the excess nervous energy of an active mind. Second, warm bathing in the evening. Third, the application of oil of roses to the forehead and temples, massaged in slowly with the fingertips. Fourth, warm drinks of either chamomile tea or diluted wine. And fifth, if all of this failed, a physician-supervised preparation of poppy juice in very small quantities, administered with care because of the risks of the larger doses. The rose oil for the forehead is worth pausing on, because it is a detail so specific and so evocative and so human. Galen describes the process of the oil application with the attention of someone who has seen it work and knows exactly how it works, slowly, with gentle pressure of the fingertips, beginning at the center of the forehead and moving outward toward the temples, then down along the sides of the head to the areas behind the ears, which the Greeks and Romans knew as places where gentle pressure or warmth produced a calming and centering effect. Rose oil would have smelled extraordinary. The roses of the ancient Mediterranean were intensely fragrant. The damask and other old rose varieties whose scent is deep and complex, and nothing like the largely scentless hybrid tea roses of the modern garden. The process of massaging rose oil into the forehead of a person who could not sleep was intimate and practical and sacred all at once, the way the best healing traditions manage to be. Now it is later in the night, and Nicias, who has drunk his chamomile wine and sat with his wife and returned to bed, has drifted into a kind of light sleep that is not quite sleep but not quite wakefulness either. He is in the borderland that the Greeks called the hypnagogic state, though they would not have used that exact word for it. The modern term hypnagogic comes from hypnos and the Greek word agogos, meaning leading, and describes the state of consciousness between wakefulness and sleep in which the brain is in a transitional state. In this state, visual images tend to appear spontaneously, disconnected and vivid, and sounds or voices may be perceived that have no external source. Many people experience small muscle jerks called hypnic jerks in this state, which can sometimes wake them again. The Greeks were very much aware of this borderland. Aristotle described it in his treatise on dreams, noting that in the state just before sleep, the mind begins to produce images that are distinct from either waking perception or full dreaming, and that these images often arise from the sensory residue of the day and the emotional concerns of the moment. He noted that in this state, small external sounds tended to be amplified and interpreted as larger things. A faint sound might be perceived as a thunderclap, a tiny light as a great flame. The hypnagogic state was the threshold of the dream world, and the Greeks paid attention to what happened there, treating the images that arose in it as potentially significant. Potentially the first messages from the divine dream space they were about to enter. Nicias, in this borderland, sees for a moment very clearly the face of his father, who has been dead for 6 years. The face is calm and kind and entirely present, and then it is gone and he is in the landscape of a harbor he does not recognize. This is the hypnagogic mind drifting between worlds. He does not fight it, he lets it move. The harbor has ships in it, and the water is very blue, and the dream deepens around him, and he goes down into it like a person, descending a gentle slope into warm water. Let us leave Nicias to his sleep, and move to a different time of the Greek world. Because the story of what ancient Greeks did when they could not sleep extends across many centuries and many different kinds of people, and each reveals something important. Let us go to Alexandria in Egypt in the 3rd century before the Common Era, because Alexandria under the Ptolemies was one of the great Greek cultural centers of the ancient world. Home to the great library that contained, at its height, something in the range of 500,000 scrolls, and to the museum, which was a kind of research institution attached to the library where scholars of every description were invited to live and study at royal expense. Among these scholars was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who was the head librarian of the Library of Alexandria and who, among other extraordinary achievements, calculated the circumference of the Earth to within a very small margin of error using trigonometry, a stick, and the observation that in seeing modern Aswan, the sun fell directly down a well shaft at noon on the summer solstice, while in Alexandria at the same moment it cast a shadow. This is one of the most remarkable individual intellectual achievements in human history, performed without any technology more sophisticated than a good stick and clear thinking. Eratosthenes was also a poet and a geographer and a mathematician, and a man who, by the testimony of his contemporaries, was someone who fell short of the very first rank in any one discipline, but was extraordinary in the breadth of his competence. His contemporaries called him Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, meaning the second best at everything, which was both a compliment and a slight. The Greeks being absolutely consistent in their inability to simply admire someone without also finding something to criticize. A man like Eratosthenes, in his rooms near the library, with scrolls on every surface and calculations on wax tablets, and the extraordinary mental life of someone who is simultaneously working on geography, mathematics, literary criticism, and the geometry of the earth, might be expected to have trouble sleeping. And indeed, the scholars of Alexandria had a reputation, captured in various anecdotes, for the particular kind of sleeplessness that comes from mental overactivity, from the inability to turn off a brain that has too many things in it, and too many interesting connections still to be made. The joke was told that you could identify a scholar of the museum by the circles under his eyes, and while the joke is attributed to later sources, the underlying truth of it was presumably ancient. What did Eratosthenes do when he could not sleep? We do not have specific testimony, but we can reconstruct it from the traditions of his time and place. He would have had access to the greatest medical library in the ancient world. The holdings of the library included the complete Hippocratic corpus and the works of subsequent Greek physicians. He would have known the remedies. He might, given his mathematical temperament, have found numbers soothing in the dark, turning over calculations in his mind with the focused pleasure that mathematicians describe when they are working on something beautiful. There is a kind of mental work that is not the agitated rumination of anxiety, but the smooth, pleasurable work of a mind genuinely engaged with something it loves. And this kind of engagement can actually assist sleep rather than prevent it, because it occupies the mind fully enough to prevent the anxious looping of unprocessed worry, while remaining calm enough not to produce arousal. The philosophers of the Stoic and Epicurean schools, which were the dominant philosophical traditions in the Greek world from the 4th century onward, both had specific things to say about sleep and about the management of wakefulness that are worth exploring in some detail. Because they represent the most sophisticated ancient thinking on the subject, and because both traditions have had enormous influence on the way Western culture has thought about the mind and its relationship to rest. The Stoics, following Zeno of Citium, who founded the school around 300 before the Common Era, were deeply interested in the governance of the emotions and the cultivation of equanimity. A calm, centered indifference to the uncontrollable fluctuations of fortune. The Stoic word for this equanimity was ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, and it was the highest psychological ideal of the tradition. A Stoic who had fully cultivated ataraxia would not be disturbed by sleeplessness, because disturbance itself was the problem, not the absence of sleep. The Stoic approach to a sleepless night was to observe the wakefulness without reacting to it, to note that the body was not currently sleeping, and to choose not to add the distress of fighting this fact to the already existing fact of the wakefulness. This is very close to what modern mindfulness-based therapies for insomnia recommend, observing wakefulness with equanimity rather than treating it as catastrophic. The Stoics also had a specific practice called the view from above, which Plato had introduced in a more elaborate form, but which the Stoics developed into a regular meditative exercise. The practitioner was to imagine themselves lifted above their immediate situation and looking down at it from a great height, eventually arriving at a view from the stars themselves, looking down at the tiny dot of the earth, and on that dot the tiny city, and in that city the tiny house, and in that house the tiny person who cannot sleep. From this perspective, the problem of sleeplessness, while real, takes on a different scale. Marcus Aurelius, who was perhaps the greatest practitioner of this exercise and who wrote about it repeatedly in his meditations, described looking down at the earth from a great height and seeing the pettiness of human concerns, not with contempt but with a liberating sense of proportion. You cannot sustain a catastrophic relationship with a problem when you are simultaneously aware of how small it is in the scale of the cosmos. The Epicureans, following Epicurus, who established his school in Athens around 300 before the Common Era, had a different approach to sleep and to sleeplessness that grew from their different philosophical priorities. Epicurus believed that the highest human good was ataraxia, the same word the Stoics used, but he understood it differently, as the pleasurable tranquility that results from the absence of pain and the presence of simple pleasures, rather than as a cultivated indifference to outcomes. For the Epicureans, the goal was to build a life of such simplicity and genuine contentment that the mind naturally tended toward calm, because there was nothing in it to cause agitation. The Epicurean prescription for good sleep was essentially a prescription for the right kind of life, a life of moderate pleasures, good friendships, freedom from political ambition and its attendant anxieties, and the cultivation of philosophical understanding that removed the fear of death and thus the fear of time's passage. Epicurus himself lived in what was called the Garden, a property just outside Athens where he and his community of friends lived and studied together, growing some of their own food, holding conversations, writing, and practicing the art of the pleasurable philosophical life. The simplicity of the garden was deliberate and was itself one of the therapies. The absence of luxury and its attendant anxieties, the presence of genuine friendship, the cultivation of present moment awareness that Epicurus called prosoch, attention, and that was the philosophical root of what later traditions would call mindfulness. Someone who lay awake in the garden could step outside and hear the leaves of the garden's trees moving in the night breeze, and smell the herbs that grew along the paths and feel the certainty of friendship around them even in sleep. And this would have been, by any measure, a good environment for rest. The question of what role friendship played in the Greek management of sleeplessness is not trivial. The Greeks had an extraordinarily developed culture of friendship, philia, which they distinguished carefully from erotic love and family love, and which they considered one of the highest human goods. Aristotle devoted 2 entire books of his Nicomachean Ethics to friendship, more pages than he gave to any other single virtue. And his treatment of it is so careful and complete and psychologically acute that it remains one of the best things ever written on the subject. Friendship for Aristotle was not merely affection, It was a form of mutual recognition, a relationship in which two people saw each other's best qualities clearly and supported each other's flourishing. The friend who knew you well was the friend you could speak to at 3 in the morning without shame, the one to whom you could say, "I cannot sleep, and I do not know why," and who would sit with you in that uncertainty without trying to fix it immediately or making you feel weak for having it. The Greek world had a specific social institution that served some of these nighttime social and reflective functions, and that institution was the symposium, the drinking party. The symposium is often described primarily as a drinking occasion, and it was that, but it was also one of the primary vehicles for intellectual life, artistic expression, and deep friendship in ancient Greece. The great texts of Greek philosophy, including Plato's Symposium and Xenophon's Symposium, are set at drinking parties where serious philosophical discussion happened alongside the wine. A symposium typically began in the evening after dinner and could continue well into the night. The participants reclined on couches arranged around a central floor space, drinking diluted wine and alternating between different kinds of activities: music, poetry recitation, philosophical debate, games, the telling of stories and jokes. The symposium at its best was the opposite of the anxious, sleepless mind. It was the mind engaged, connected, delighted, moving through ideas and human warmth with the easy flow of good conversation and the gentle lubrication of shared wine. A person who attended a good symposium and then walked home through the dark streets of Athens in the company of friends would arrive home tired in the best way. Tired with the pleasant fatigue of having been fully present and alive for several hours, the kind of tiredness that is not depletion but completion. And they would sleep. We have been in ancient Greece for a long time now, moving through its various approaches to the sleepless night, and before we begin to turn toward our conclusion, there is one more thread to follow that brings everything together. It is the thread of myth, of the great stories that the Greeks told about sleep and night and darkness, because these stories were not mere entertainment. They were the containers in which the Greek understanding of the deepest human experiences was held and transmitted. And the stories about sleep and night are among the most beautiful and the most revealing in the entire mythological tradition. Nyx, the goddess of night, was one of the oldest deities in the Greek cosmological tradition. In Hesiod's Theogony, the great poem of divine genealogy written in the 8th century before the Common Era, Nyx is among the very first beings to emerge from the primordial chaos. She is of extraordinary power and antiquity. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, was said to defer to Nyx, to be unwilling to anger her because he feared her power. And her children are the qualities of the night itself: Hypnos, sleep; Thanatos, death; Moros, fate; Waniroi, the dreams; Nemesis, divine retribution; Eris, strife; the Hesperides, the nymphs of the golden evening. These children of night were not simply abstract concepts. They were beings, presences, forces with their own will and their own relationship to mortals. To lie down to sleep was to enter the realm of Nyx and her children. It was to give yourself over to something enormous and ancient and only partially knowable. This is why the Greeks treated the transition into sleep with such care and such attention. It was not a simple mechanical process of the body shutting down. It was a journey into a divine territory from which you might return changed, or through which you might receive messages you could not receive in the daylight. The sleepless person was someone who stood at the entrance to this territory and could not cross the threshold. And the task of getting them across was therefore not merely a medical or practical task, but in some sense a spiritual one. The Waniroi, the spirits of dreams, were believed to travel through the night, delivering their various messages to sleeping mortals. True dreams came through the gate of horn and false ones through the gate of ivory, as Homer told us, but the Waniroi themselves were not simply neutral messengers. They could be sent by Zeus, by Apollo, by Hermes, who was the divine messenger and who accompanied souls to the underworld and was therefore also the conductor of the soul through the dream world. A person who received a dream from a god was receiving something real, something that required attention and response. The sleepless person was not receiving these messages. They were cut off from the divine communication that the night was supposed to carry. This gave the sleepless state a quality of spiritual isolation, of being left out of something important, that added to the practical discomfort of simple tiredness. The remedy was therefore also partly a spiritual reconnection. The rituals of purification, the offerings at the temple before sleep, the prayers to Hypnos himself asking for his gift, these were not superstition added on top of the practical remedies. They were part of the same integrated approach to the problem. An approach that saw the human being not as a body with a sleep-wake mechanism that needed adjustment, but as a soul embedded in a cosmos with which it needed to be in right relationship. When the relationship was right, when the offerings were made and the body was prepared and the mind was quiet and the gods were willing, sleep came naturally. When it did not come, it meant something in the relationship needed attention. Nicias wakes again near dawn, which is not unusual in the ancient two-sleep pattern. He has slept for 3 or 4 hours in the middle period, the first sleep of the night, and now he is in the waking interval between first sleep and second sleep. The sky through the courtyard is beginning to shift very slightly from black to a deep blue that has not yet decided to be color. The birds will begin soon. He knows this quality of light and what it means, that he has perhaps an hour before the first pale stroke of dawn, and that in this hour, in this particular quality of awareness that comes after first sleep, the mind is at its clearest and most permeable. He uses this time as his tradition taught him to. He reviews his day, the day now ended. He turns over in his mind the small problem of his supplier relationship, which the dream with the cracked amphora has been suggesting to him. And in the pre-dawn clarity, he sees what he should do about it, which is simply to speak directly with the man and settle the pricing question with a frank conversation, rather than continuing to let it sit between them like a piece of furniture nobody wants to acknowledge. This clarity feels like a gift from the night, which it is, in the sense that the night has provided the quiet and the distance that the clarity required. He lies in this clarity for a while, content with it. And then, as the birds begin their earliest tentative conversations, as the light outside the window shifts from deep blue to the first grey of before dawn, as Rome, or rather Athens, begins its long breath of morning, Nicias finds sleep again. It is a light sleep, the second sleep of the night, the sleep of the pre-dawn hours that is said to be the most visionary, the most dreamful. He sinks into it easily, with the ease of a body that has processed its night, that has done its waking work of reflection and has found what it needed. The dream that comes to him now is simple and beautiful. He is in his workshop, but it is perfectly arranged. The kiln is in the right place. The amphora on the table is smooth and whole, and the glaze on it is the deep dark color that he has been trying to achieve for months. He picks it up and turns it in his hands, and it is exactly right. He sleeps until the full light of morning, and now we come, slowly and without hurry, to the end of our long night in ancient Greece. The streets of Athens are brightening outside. The vendors of the agora are setting up their stalls. Somewhere a dog is announcing the morning with the enthusiasm that only dogs bring to the simple fact of a new day. The olive trees on the hills above the city are catching the first light, their silver-green leaves turning gold at the tips. Children are being chased from their beds by mothers whose patience for the two-sleep luxury does not extend to the mid-morning. The smoke of cooking fires is beginning to rise from the houses. The Greeks who lay awake through the night are waking now with whatever the night brought them. Some are rested, some are not yet fully restored but are better than they were. Some have a dream to carry into the day and examine. Some have a thought that arrived in the pre-dawn clarity that they will need to act on. Some simply feel the ordinary grace of morning after a difficult night, the way the day looks different when you have been through the dark and come out the other side. What the ancient Greeks understood about sleeplessness that is most worth carrying with us, as we lie in whatever darkness we are lying in tonight, is this. They understood it as a condition of the whole person, not a mechanical failure of a single system. They understood that the body, the mind, the soul, and the cosmos were all involved in the experience of rest and its absence. They brought to the problem the same thoroughness they brought to every human question, which means they left us a treasury of approaches. From the most practical herb preparation to the most elevated philosophical practice, and the treasury is still open. The chamomile is still in our pharmacies and our herbal stores. The practice of evening review still works exactly as Pythagoras said it did. The wisdom of getting up and doing something calm rather than fighting wakefulness in bed is exactly what modern sleep therapists recommend. The value of warm baths and cool foreheads and moderate food and good friendship and the view of the stars and the slow breath in the dark has not diminished by a single measure in 2,500 years. The Greeks could not sleep sometimes, and they dealt with it with intelligence and grace, and the characteristic Greek conviction that even the most difficult human experience contained, if you paid attention to it properly, something worth knowing. They lay awake and looked at the stars and thought about their lives. They prepared their herbs and their baths and their prayers. They entered the healing sanctuaries and lay down in the sacred dark and waited for the god to come. They talked to their wives in the night kitchen over cups of warm honeyed wine. They reviewed their days with patient honesty. They breathed slowly in the dark and let the vast quiet of the ancient Mediterranean night hold them, and eventually, one way or another, sleep came. It always does, and now you know what the ancient Greeks did when they could not sleep, and perhaps, if you are still awake, you are a little less awake than you were when we began. The stars that Nicias watched from his courtyard are the same stars above you now, the same light, only older. The night has not changed its essential nature. The darkness is still the realm of Hypnos and his brother and the children of Nyx, and somewhere in that realm there is a place waiting for you. A warm and quiet place where the Waniroi are preparing something beautiful to send through the gate of Horn. Let the night have you now, let Hypnos bring his gift. You have listened long enough, now it is time to rest.